It's a misty August morning in the year 2000. John and I are at the foot of Momain, the holy mountain in the heart of Connemara.
Well, on this beautiful morning, and it is lovely and foggy, like it's the ideal landscape to see these mountains in. We're at the foot of Momain, just about to climb up towards Momain in the middle of the Connemara Mountains. And there's a deep layer of cloud down, halfway down the mountains. And the light is very mute. In certain places, the morning sun is coming through the clouds, making it very white, the fog. And there's a stream flowing to our right here that comes down from the mountains. So there's a great kind of stillness, and the sheep are all in their first stage of morning activity, grazing away in their lovely zen kind of nonchalance. And we're about to ascend.
Well, let us ascend. Now, I won't say we haven't quite reached the summit of Momain, but it is within hailing distance and within our vision, but also within our vision looking back over this Connemara landscape. It does what the walk up the hill did. It takes your breath away. So this place speaks to you in a lot of ways, John.
It does really, and I mean, I wasn't born here, but I've lived here a long time, and I really find it an incredible presence and companion in my life, really. And I suppose people often think of Connemara landscape as very lonesome. And I live in a little cottage down here, and in some strange way, you're never lonesome there. Because if you look out the window, there's the constant drama of the landscape unfolding before you in the different light that is always at play here. And I've never known a landscape that is as dependent on light as the Connemara landscape. When the light is here, the whole place is luminous and really alive with such subtlety of colour. And when the light goes, then the landscape is so eerie and in the grip of gravity. I've always been very moved by this, and several years ago I tried to put it in a poem called Connemara in Our Mind that I'd like to read now. Connemara in Our Mind. It gave us the hungry landscapes resting upon the unalleviated bog dream. Put us out there where tenderness never settled, except for the odd nest of grouse mutterings in the grieving rushes. Washed our eyes in the glories of light. In an instant the whole place flares in a glaze of pools, as if a kind sun let a red net sink through the bog, reach down to a forgotten infancy of granite, and dredge up a hall of colours that play and sparkle through the smother of bog, pinks, yellows, amber and orange. Your saffron scarf filled with wind rises over your head like a halo, then swings to catch the back of your neck like a sickle. The next instant the dark returns the sweep of rotting land, shrunken and vacant. Listen. You can almost hear the hunger falling back into itself. This is no place to be. With the sun withdrawn, the bog wants to sink, break the anchor of rock that holds it up. We are left. There is no one who knows us. So in a certain way, you see, this landscape belongs to no one, but belongs primarily to itself. And landscape is the firstborn of creation. It was here for hundreds of millions of years before ever a plant or an animal arrived here. It was also here, obviously, before the human face ever emerged on earth. And it must have seemed very strange to the ancient eye of landscape when we arrived here. So landscape has a huge pre-human memory. It precedes everything that we know. I often think that you could talk almost about a clayography, the whole biography of the earth. Everything depends, of course, on whether you think landscape is dead matter or whether you think it's a living presence.
Well, I was going to just put that point to you. I mean, to many people, to be seated here on a rock on the side of a mountain and looking across at mountains, the only life they would consider would be the sheep grazing or the occasional bird flying overhead, or possibly the stream as a life. But you would contend that there is life here in these rocks and these great mountains all about us.
Yeah, I think there is life, and I also think because there's life that there is memory. And I think that the more you live among mountains like this, the more aware you become of the cadences of the place and the subtlety of the place's kind of presence and personality. When you look out from us here now this morning, you see here down in front of Maumeen the beginning of the 12 Bends. And the fog is halfway down the mountain. And I know these mountains and there is another half of the mountain concealed inside that fog that the eye cannot actually see. And I often think that it's an incredible image of the imagination, that with the mind you can't penetrate that blanket of cover, but with the imagination you can sense the presence that's actually there that you can't see with the eye. And you have all the time with the light and the cloud and the rain and the mist here, a whole kind of narrative of presence unfolding, hiding itself, emerging. Not alone that, I think, but I think one of the frightening things about Connemara for a lot of people is how lunar and how bare it actually seems. One mustn't forget, of course, that it's mainly bog. And bog is, I suppose, the afterlife of a forest, of all the trees that were here. So even though we're looking down now, John, on major kind of emptiness and bare granite mountains, there was a time when this place was completely clustered and covered in with forest and with trees. And there's a poem that I wrote a while ago trying to reimagine that, called The Angel of the Bog. The angel of the bog mourns in the wind that loiters all over these black meadows, remembers how it chose branches to strum from the orchestra of trees that stood here, how at twilight a chorus of birds came to silence in nests of darkening air. Raindrops filtered through leaves, silver the air, wash off the film of dust to release nets of fragrance on which the wind can sweeten before expiring among the debris that brightens each year with fallen colour before the weight of winter seals the ground. The dark eyes of the angel of the bog never open now when dawn comes to dress the famished grass with splendid veils of red, amber, white, as if its soul were urgent and young with possibility and dreams that a vanished life might become visible.
And of course, when you talk about mountains having memory, as it were, if they do, they have a memory of a time that they were suppressed and covered with ice.
Absolutely. I was often thinking about that, you know. One time, if the human eye had been able to look out over this landscape, maybe 10,000 years ago or more, all it would have seen would have been grey, kind of dead, black ice everywhere, and everything covered completely. And it must have been an incredibly frightening and suffocating experience for the land, that all its colour was overtaken gradually with the surge of the grey breath of the cold, and then the snow, and then the ice freezing down on top of it, and to be suffocated under hundreds of feet of this pack ice must have been an incredible experience for the landscape. And to have lived that way for thousands of years, that you can imagine when the first trickles of water began to loosen and the glaciers gradually began to move, and that when the landscape became free of this cold darkness on top of it, the first time that the sun touched it, and seeds maybe hidden for thousands of years began to awaken in the earth. It must have been an incredible emergence from the landscape. So the landscape, you see, has the memory of the time of ice that the human knows nothing about, except, I believe, because we're made out of clay, that in some sense that memory is within our clay as well. And I often think that maybe that's the reason that fear can get to us so quickly, that maybe what fear does is awaken this relic cold in the bone again. We hear here behind us now, just over Maumeen, the kind of tattered screeching of a crow. And you'd often look at them when you'd be up here in the mountains and see the birds kind of soaring in and sweeping out of the place. And it's lovely sometimes to watch animals and see how at home they are in a landscape. And how, if you look across here now, we see sheep, you know. And the sheep are, I think, the old kind of undercover mystics of this Connemara landscape. I often think that they're totally in a kind of zen mode of stillness. You know, you often see it if you drive the roads here. You'd see them lying out in the middle of the road and they'd pay no attention to you as you slow down and pass on. They're chewing and ruminating on something totally different altogether. And the birds here too. I mean, there's huge kind of populations of birds here that know these places better than the human foot or the human eye can ever know. They fit together, the landscape and the animals. And the animals, of course, are our older brothers and sisters. They were here before we were. And I often think that maybe one of the next breakthroughs in the evolution of human consciousness will be the recognition of the subtle complexity and the hidden inner worlds that animals actually carry around with them. I often think that the innocence and silence of the animal world has a huge subtlety to it that is anything but dumb, but notices everything and is present in everything. I think animals carry a huge ministry of witness to the silence of time and to the depth of nature. They're like the landscape in a sense. They live too in the mode of silence. And it must be strange for a mountain often to look at humans, you know, and the way they go around, their limbs and their eyes blurred with desire and movement, and their inability to stay still in the one place. I mean, it was Pascal who said that most of our troubles emerge from our inability to sit still in a room. And stone manages that. Like, look at the stones here. Been here for tens of thousands of years. They don't move. They just stay all the time. Like in the old Shanachal thing that they have here, Muintir Connemara, they say, Casan na dini ar chéile, ach ní chastar na schläft ar chéile. And when you look out at the 12 bins, like there's little enough distance between them, but yet they have never once in hundreds of thousands of years managed to move and to kind of relate to each other. I often feel that, you know, that there is a world, maybe an infinite world of dream hidden at the heart of a mountain, and that maybe part of the duty of the artist is in a certain sense to imaginatively excavate the secret dream world of the mountains. Because I think that, you know, that if you do agree that landscape is alive and that it is a presence, maybe then it is in the shape of landscape, the form of the mountains, that you actually get an expression of the state of consciousness of the place. And in that sense, you know, if you go on that perspective, then the mountains of Connemara have risen very high, almost as noble guardians of the memory of the place, and almost as lookouts in some sense for the infinite and the eternal. And the fog coming down today now in these mountains is just amazing. I mean, I've been out here and I've got lost in the mountains down the Burren too. And you know, when you're out and you know a place and you think you know where you're going, when that fog comes down and you're inside in it, all you see is maybe 4 or 5 feet ahead of you, and you can walk for hours and find yourself back in the same place. I mean, the Kyo, you know, they talk about it here, the Kyo Drioch that you have in the evening and that. But like the Kyo, the fog is a strange confusion. Like it's almost like fear, the way it falsifies everything.
So in that sense, are we, as humans, as mere humans, are we in a sense interfering by being up here? And I say that as we watch another line of humans approach, because this is also a place of pilgrimage. It is a sacred place. But to some extent, do humans interfere, or should they interfere with a landscape like this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But you know, it's also important, I suppose, to say that it is, like you have mentioned, a place of pilgrimage. And Professor Micheál Mac Grail of Maynooth has done great work here in being involved in getting a little church built. And there's a beautiful statue here by Cleona Cusson of St. Patrick, Ira Wamein, with the sheep just around his leg in the stone, beautifully carved by her. And every in the Hesta, Micheál Mac Grail leads the Stáisiún na Crische here, and I think it's Joe John Machanyamara sings Shanos, that beautiful old Irish thing, Queen in a Dreamwira, which would break your heart with the pathos of it, you know. So there is that here, and I often think, you know, that in terms of liturgy and that our liturgies have become very bony and very spindly and have none of the sensuous kind of textures of landscape in them. And maybe that's one of the ways of reviving liturgy, is bringing it out into the landscape and allowing the elemental kind of force of the landscape to clothe the liturgy again with sensuous texture and enable us to come in. But that question about intrusion, you know, one of the most wonderful photographers in Ireland, and a person who specialises in Connemara, is Fergus Burke. And he's taken some amazing black and white pictures of this place. And Fergus is lovely. He's a lovely man. He's a genius. But I remember one day we had exactly that conversation, you know, and we were kind of agreeing with each other that in a certain way, you know, coming in here, you're talking about the right to intrude. What gives the person the right to intrude on this place? And I suppose the only thing you can say is that the quality of your presence here in this way, in order not to be voyeuristic or consumerist, has to slow down to the kind of level of attention where you begin to come into rhythm with the landscape. And I think Fergus Burke's work is a witness to that. Incredible moments that he almost catches the landscape out in conversation with itself, you know.
Can I just go back to this notion of silence, because in a previous programme in this series, Paddy Graham, the artist, had similar things to say as you when he went out, and was again in a midland bogland outside Mullingar, and we actually stood and listened to the silence, which of course wasn't silence because there were a lot of things happening, but to him, silence was and is a kind of prayer.
Yeah, I think you see that one of the things that humans have done, and especially Western consciousness, is that we have hijacked all the primary mystical qualities for the human mind. And we have made this claim that only the human self has soul and that everything else is desouled or unsouled as a result of that. And I think that's an awful travesty of presence, because I think that landscape has a soul and has a presence. And I think landscape living in the mode of silence is always wrapped in seamless prayer. And you know, in the old Eternal Echoes book, Exploring Our Yearning to Belong, I tried to explore that thing about the prayer of landscape. Meister Eckhart said that nothing in the universe resembles God so much as silence. So if you think about silence in that sense, then to come into silence is to come into the presence of the divine, and in a way to allow yourself to be enfolded by that stillness. Because in a real sense, I think the deepest thing in the human heart is not the verbiage, but is actually that still silence. That is not the silence of Buddhism, which is often kind of, seems to me maybe sometimes anonymous, but it's the silence of intimacy where no word is needed, and where a word would actually be a fracture.
But it is also a thing that, particularly maybe in this post-modern, post-industrial world, that that frightens us, that we become uneasy with silence, and silence is really a space that must be filled with sound of some kind.
Oh, to the postmodern mind, silence is terror. And I think that that's one of the healing ministries that a landscape like this performs, is that in a way it's the custodian of a great unclaimed silence that urbanized postmodernity hasn't raided yet. But I mean, one of my fears would be because of the way that technology is invading space now. I mean, which was invading space and going off out to the moon and all that, that was going far away from us. But now with the invention of virtual space and cyberspace, we have actually the commercialization of space. And I'd be afraid, you know, that because of the technological possibilities that are going to emerge, that it could happen. I mean, it's a nightmare scenario that in 10 or 20 years' time, leaving Oughterard and driving that bare stretch of road here to Maumeen, which is empty, like, and vacant, and has this lovely void quality, that you'd be liable to drive it and have at every juncture like these beamed images that wouldn't be actually on placards, but would be beamed images of kind of things to sell or things to do or all that, like, so that the invasion of space could actually get to that level, like.
I thought for a minute you were going to say there would be beamed images of Maumeen, so you wouldn't have to leave the main road.
Well, I mean, that's the struggle we had in Mullaghmore, was to kind of keep the beamed image away and save the mountain.
Indeed, indeed. You spoke earlier about the effect of light on landscape like this. Now, again, so the magic of radio and the magic of imagination, can you darken this landscape for me? Because I know you and the Millennium Eve, you went up not this mountain but another mountain to spend the night on the bare mountain, to coin a phrase, in the dark. And I'm just trying to imagine if we were to sit here 12 hours from now, and what would we feel, see?
Yeah.
hear?
Well, the Millennium Eve, like, I wanted to try and do something special, and there was loads of old parties and things going on, but it seemed to me to be a night, I suppose everyone had their own way of doing it, that you should be alone with the landscape. And I went off up overhead Blackhead and spend the night out in the mountain. And it was really fascinating. I mean, first things when you go out in a place like that on your own, where humans have never lived, like, but have passed through during the day and have rarely been there in the night, is that you feel that you have come into a network of sounds that you don't normally hear. And at the beginning the sounds are kind of frightening, like, because you don't know what they are, but then you settle down with them, you know, and then you feel yourself being taken into the landscape. And here in Connemara, and it was lovely, you know, and then the dawn, to watch the dawn coming out in the mountain and the moon behind the mountain that night, and then the dawn coming in, and on the limestone that morning, it was almost like the sea had just vacated the place. The limestone was rendered so white by the new sun of the first day of the new millennium. Here in Connemara, there is a deeper kind of darkness than in the limestone of Clare, which is a very white, feminine kind of stone that was really sisterly and friendly with the light. Here there's kind of light resistance and darkness, and it gets very, very dark here. But one of the lovely things here is when it gets very dark on a cold night, is the skies are magnificent in terms of stars, like, because you've no light pollution, and you get this clarity of all these little white apertures in this big wall of darkness twinkling down at you. It's really amazing. I mean, you become aware that you're living in a universe, you know, because during the day with the clouds and all the rest of it, you kind of move on and you're busy. But at night, when you get a chance to linger and really look, you become aware of the infinite distances that are out there, and that light that is reaching you now is coming from stars that have gone out of existence for thousands of years. And it's really an amazing kind of almost tenderness of distance that somehow kind of reaches you, you know. Here in Connemara, there is a deeper kind of darkness than in the limestone of Clare, which is a very white, feminine kind of stone that was really sisterly and friendly with the light. Here there's kind of light resistance and darkness, and it gets very, very dark here. But one of the lovely things here is when it gets very dark on a cold night, is the skies are magnificent in terms of stars, like, because you've no light pollution, and you get this clarity of all these little white apertures in this big wall of darkness twinkling down at you. It's really amazing. I mean, you become aware that you're living in a universe, you know, because during the day with the clouds and all the rest of it, you kind of move on and you're busy. But at night, when you get a chance to linger and really look, you become aware of the infinite distances that are out there, and that light that is reaching you now is coming from stars that have gone out of existence for thousands of years. And it's really an amazing kind of almost tenderness of distance that somehow kind of reaches you, you know.
But in the same way that for some people the absence of sound, in other words, or silence, is disturbing for them, did you find that the absence of light anyway disturbing? Were you confronted by almost seeing yourself in a mirror of darkness, or were you afraid simply of the unknown, even though you knew where you were, roughly speaking?
Yeah, you would be, and there'd be moments that the old fear had crossed your mind, you know. And it'd cross your mind in different ways, because you'd feel like so alien outside in a landscape that gets on totally without you, and that seems to take no notice of you, and has its own life, and will work its own destiny millions of years after you're actually gone. Like, I mean, it's that kind of huge perspective that you get out in landscape. And I suppose, talking of darkness, one of the fascinating aspects of darkness in a landscape like this is the interior darkness of the landscape, you know. I often think that landscape is surface, you know, and that if you had a huge machine that could go down maybe 2 foot and remove the surface, that people wouldn't know where they were at all. Because we live on the surface of the planet. There is an infinity of darkness under us that we rarely touch. Like, we see it only when we open the earth in the springtime, we sow things, or sometimes when we dig a grave, like, you see that you're creating a kind of opening where there's a huge eternal night that is never fractured by light, that lives all the time underneath you. And one of the first times that I encountered that was as a child at home when we'd go to the bog cutting turf. And like Connemara is mainly bog. When you look down here, you see turf everywhere, you know. And it was always a fascinating thing, you know. We at home, like, we'd a farm, and you worked in the bog and the meadow and the mountains and that. But the bog was always my favourite place, because you'd come and you'd start off the first day you'd be in the bog. My father and Pete, the Lord Mercy, and my uncle, you'd kind of measure out the bank of turf, and you'd put the line down, and you'd race it with the hay knife, and then you'd cut it across, and then you'd take off what we used to call the cleaning, the first sod of it. Like. And then the first cut, the first bore of turf, the first layer of turf, like, was very brown, and it was soggy. It's soggy, like, and stodgy, almost like what you had cut away. But then as you cut down, like, and we'd have had trenches of turf that would have been 6 or 7 bars down, and as you cut down, you got the black turf, the best turf, like black, clear butter, right at the bottom, like, and you took it off the stone and off out of the water. And in a way, you see, when you were cutting down each bar, you were going back hundreds of years in time, because it had taken hundreds and thousands of years for this to form. You'd get seeds of old plants inside in it. You'd get wonderful bog dale and bits of bog oak. And in a certain sense, what you were doing was going into the memory of the landscape that was totally pre-human. And I suppose no Irish writer has explored that better than Seamus Heaney in his amazing collection North, where he really goes into almost the secret archive of the bog, and it's done with such tight, formal beauty and such a sense of edge and danger to it. And the social life, you could say, out in the bog was wonderful, because all the neighbours were cutting turf beside you. And then there's no tea that I've ever drunk like the tea that you make out in the bog.
No hunger you've ever experienced.
That's right, yeah. No, but you'd get the new turf, like our turf from last year, you'd make a little fire and you'd boil the tea in the kettle and put rushes into the mouth of the kettle so that the smoke wouldn't go into the kettle, and then boil the tea, and you'd have maybe sandwiches and that, and it was just wonderful. And the cora, like the chat and people talking, and then the rhythm of people cutting turf. And, you know, it was a lovely way to watch how people dwelt, the art of dwelling in a landscape. You'd see a man cutting turf, and you'd learn to cut turf yourself. You'd know that it was the rhythm, like that you take it up with the rhythm. And then people, you'd see everyone every so often in their own time pausing to just look across the landscape and then go back into the work again. It was work as real conversation with the landscape, not abuse or kind of a raiding of the landscape, you know. And you think of psychology now and people stressed and all the rest of it, like, and people in high power jobs and low power jobs where there's nothing but, like, to use the full intent and force of the Marxist term, alienation. Like, I think Karl Marx is going to make a huge return again because of the way the corporate world is colonizing the world and taking everything over. Like, and I think an awful lot of people are hugely alienated in their work, and the people have to make little spaces in it for themselves, or otherwise they'll really their whole lives will become toxic. And I know it's a romantic and primitive peasant image, but to think of the way people worked in that landscape at that time, you know, they were really enriched, awakened, and renewed by their work outside in the landscape. Like, that's why when you'd come back home at night after a full day working in the bog, you'd be dead tired, like, especially if you were foot and turf, you'd have a pain across your back. But the thing about it was that your body might have been tired, like, but it wasn't exhausted and it wasn't stressed, like, just tired with a good wholesome tiredness, but your mind was like still water, like, it was just lovely.
In that sense, do people, when they work on the bog, do they become different, or do they become more their real selves? There's some kind of a, when you talk about the social discourse and that, there's some kind of a loosening up. And maybe it's because, as you say, they're in conversation with the landscape.
Yeah, I think, John, there is a loosening up, and that there is some kind of returning, you know, coming home to yourself. If you look at the great religious traditions, like, you know, the Christian monastic tradition, like, one of the things they had was time for work in the fields, time for work in the old scriptorium, time for play, and there was a wholesome, balanced kind of diversity. And I think that when people did work on the bog and were out like that there was also the satisfaction of a return for your work, you know. And the old stuff that we're at now, the work of the mind, you know, you work and work and work. You could spend days and weeks reading a text trying to understand what's hidden in it, like a text of philosophy or that. And then when you have the click and the old insight and you see, now I get what's going on here and what the subtext and the subterranean stuff is in it. It's all an interior thing happening in the air element, really. But when you're working out in the bog and you see a palmarv of turf like after you that you've cut out, and you watch the sun beginning to harden it, there's a great sense of satisfaction for what you've actually done, and you see a return for your work, you know. I also think that you know, that in a way the human body emerging from landscape, that we need that kind of forceful dialectic almost of physical, sensuous, elemental interaction. If you look at like them sheep around here now, the sheep are fairly cool, like, but if you look at rabbits and the hares and birds and foxes sometimes that you see here and that, like, there's this seamless kind of wildness to them. There's that sense of the fluency of the place that they're in and the way they move in it and that. And I think one of the old reasons that the postmodern mind is so tight and packed and in a way so fractured is that we've lost touch completely with our wildness. And I often think that one of the most natural ways of coming home to your wildness is going out among wild places. And I mean, you can see this visually now, that years ago when people worked more in the land, they had winnowed faces, like, that had an elemental look to them. And if you saw a person in town or in Galway now and look at them, you'd say, geez, that's a farmer, or that's whatever. Now, like, there's a huge, it's a subtle thing, you know, but it's a greater homogenization of the faces. You also see it in terms of walk, like the way people walked. You know, they walked like they were walking on land. Now people tend to walk more like they were trained in some kind of an academy. They're more corridor kind of walks, like. But land people walk in a land kind of way, do you know? And the spread of the land is on them almost, and it's a peasant kind of thing. I think one of the lovely words is peasant. Like, I think that the derogatory sense of looking at farming and looking at people who work on the land is so uninformed and naive and vulgar. But I think it's very difficult for people of the land to find vocabulary for the dignity of their work and presence and belonging, you know. And so much of modern opinion is now fashioned in the urban world, the city, and by urban forces. And if you look at television, for instance, and see in a week's programs like how many of them refer to land or landscape in a way that would make the people who inhabit these places feel that they're in a noble kind of setting. There are very, very, very few altogether. And when you think back then further into folk culture and folk consciousness, like there was a time when that was the world, like that was the most beautiful way to dwell on the earth.
Another feature of the landscape which we look across now, of course, is water. That the valley we're looking across is pocked with these small pools and larger pools and lakes in the distance, and of course the little rivulets and streams running down into those lakes. But apart from its obvious metaphor of being healing and cleansing and so on, but water speaks to you also.
Well, the thing now, the nice thing about rising up and climbing Maumeen here is you get a kind of a bird's eye view of a section of the Connemara landscape. And a thing that you wouldn't often realise when you're just travelling the road is how many lakes there are here and how much water there is here. And in a way, the huge conversation at Connemara is a conversation between the granite and the lakes and the water. And bog water is dark water. Do you know, when I remember when I came to live here first, when you'd fill a bath at that, you'd think the water was actually dirty, but it wasn't dirt that was in the water. It was the tone, the colour tone of the actual water. It's strong water. And here you have beautiful lakes, like inside in the middle of the mountains, beautiful streams, sound of mountain streams, and lovely rivers. And one of the things that I always like is after a huge rainfall, like for a day or a couple of days or a night, when you'd wake up in the morning, when you'd look up, like here behind us now, you can see an example of it. And this mountain here, you see drains, empty drains down the side of the mountain. But these drains are only temporarily empty, because when the rains come back and the water comes off the top of the mountain, it'll know exactly how to find its way down to the lakes and the streams below. And so often you'd see
the music begins.
Then the music begins, and you'd often see in a morning like that all these massive silver, almost like chiffon streams waving down the side of the mountain, you know, ornamenting and bedecking the mountain. It's a lovely, lovely kind of sight.
And of course, having brought up the question of water, I mean, the landscape has responded, and the cloud has now come down the mountain, and the mist and the rain has which is never very far away, I suppose, has begun to descend upon us.
It has. Well, always like in Connemara. Do you know what I mean? There's a great presence of rain and mist in that. And to be honest with you, like one of my fears for the old Irish thing, and I suppose I haven't been involved in the Burn Action Group for the last 10 years, is watching the way the government relentlessly and almost, I'd say, unethically nurtures and feeds the tourist industry. And I mean, Ireland is a small country, do you know? And if the tourist numbers aren't somehow modified, the place will be completely overrun. And that's why I often think that it's great that it rains so much in Ireland, you know, and that there's a shower either just gone or maybe one coming. Because if this was like the Canary Islands or something and we had sun all the time, the place would be totally overrun. I mean, you see it in the road. I don't grudge anyone. Like, it's lovely for people to come to Ireland and to see and enjoy the place. And I mean, a lot of people, do you know, students and that in Germany, and you know, you meet people from all over the world out the mountains who've saved for years for an old ticket to come here. And a lot of the big number of the people who come here because they know there's something special in Ireland. You know, well, Irish people always think they're special anyway, like. But there is some old thing in the Irish landscape that is is very, very alluring, very attractive, and deeply satisfying in some way. There's a kind of almost an old rhythm in the landscape that recalls people to what has been taken from them, or what they've forgotten, or what they neglect in some sense. But the other side of it is that the numbers are absolutely huge, you know. And when you're normally now when you be driving here to Galway, that'd take you 30 or 40 minutes to go to Galway. But once it gets to the middle of April, you have to put 20 minutes onto it, because what you find is convoys all the time on the road, buses and cars and all the rest of it. And I think that the tourist thing needs to be kind of really looked at, because voyeuristic commercial tourism just does huge damage. There's a lovely, wonderful scientist in England, Rupert Sheldrake, who's an amazing man. But Rupert was asked one time at a big conference, what single change would he recommend for the new millennium that could make a difference to the world? And Rupert said, if every tourist were to become a pilgrim. And I think there's a lot of depth in that, you know. Talking about landscape again, something totally different now before we leave here, because the rain is closing in. See the way in the mist now. Yeah, shroud. It's shroud near us,
being drawn back,
but the veil is coming down. See the three mountains that were there now to our right are just completely kind of disappeared. And the mountains here behind us, they're just being veiled, and they're going back in again to their kind of invisibility. Do you know the way people say, you were too visible, or you're overexposed, or whatever? I often think, that at times, even mountains need to get away from visibility, and maybe this is their way of doing it. But I'm just back. We were after an old bit of a holiday there in Lanzarote, and Lanzarote is only 68 miles, I think, from Morocco. It's way out, and one of the fascinating things about it that we went to see was there was a volcano there. And back in 1730, a volcano erupted, and covered 1/3 of the island. So I'd never go there again. I mean, I would never go into that place again, because we drove for about 14 kilometres just through landscape that was almost a secondary layer of landscape on top of the normal one, which was the volcanic eruption. And now it was just fascinating to see it. There was no kind stone anywhere. There was no real stone, in a sense. It was all broken gravel. It was almost like black megalithic porridge. And your mind or your heart couldn't rest anywhere in it. And it was homeless, And in a certain sense, that witnesses to the dark side of landscape. Landscape can speak to you, but landscape can also render you speechless, because deep down at the core of the earth, there's this huge fire which throws up things, and out of which rock was formed. And all this here that we're on now was thrown up, and in a certain sense, by life and history, has been domesticated somewhat and made more personable, But there is that almost infinite blackness to at the heart of landscape that can be quite terrifying and frightening.
Well, the stones here are much friendlier.
Oh, they are, and kinder.
I think that is why I suddenly realised I'm sitting here in my shirt sleeves. Yeah. The rain is coming down.
The rain is coming down, exactly.
I don't know whether it's you or the stones, but that are beguiling me. Probably the combination of both.
Yeah. One of the great poets of landscape is Wendell Berry. He's a farmer out in Kentucky. He was big in the literary scene in New York, and then he just retired, went off down home, and he's farmed for years and years and written wonderful poems. And one of his poems, he says, I go out into the grace of wild things and am free. And one of the first poems in his book Sabbaths is about that wisdom of presence and knowing that there is in landscape, and how in a certain sense landscape wants to speak to us, really. The title of your series, that landscape, it's not just that you hear it speaking to you, but in some sense landscape wants to address us. I mean, I think it's Hölderlin who said that the humans are here just to witness and maybe say the word tree and say the word stone and that there's something eternal going on in landscape, that often that we're not subtle enough to pick up, And before I read Wendell's poem, I'll just finish with the little kind of anecdote parable thing. which always to me is a great old kind of just revelation. It always recalls me to the things that we're not seeing at all, you see. The radar of our senses is incredibly limited, like, even though it's beautiful. But it was a friend of mine who pointed out to me years ago in the Scientific American, I think there was this parable of a stone. I've adapted it for my own purpose now, but there's a stone in a corner of a meadow. And under that stone there's a colony of ants. And they're just ordinary ants doing their ant kind of thing up and down. But the different thing about this colony is that there's a genius ant among them, who's a total genius. I mean, has the ant archives, all ant knowing, ant possibilities, like a kind of an Einstein ant. And after a while, when everybody in the ant colony realizes how brilliant this one is, they say, you know, that she has nothing more to learn in there. So the board of the ant colony get together and they say, you know, we want to talk to you. You have no more to learn here. You need to go out into the world. So they do ant leaving rituals and everything to get send the ant off. And say on a Thursday evening, a misty evening in October, the ant is finally has received all the valedictions and comes out from under the stone. This is a genius ant. And say it comes out from under the stone, and just that evening there happens to be grazing nearby a totally non-metaphysical horse who's just grazing away. Now, regardless of how brilliant our genius ant is, it will never be able to perceive the horse because of the disproportion in the sizes. And you know, I often think, like, are there presences all around us that because of the disproportion between our senses and their presence that we're not picking up at all, and that we're seeing a lot more vacancy in the world and voids than there actually are? And maybe that's what the old artists and the mystics do, is that they attend to seeming emptiness and find incredible riches there and huge textures of presence. And Wendell Berry is a man who attends deeply to nature. And this is a beautiful poem. I go among trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet around me like circles on water. My tasks lie in their places where I left them asleep like cattle. Then what is afraid of me comes and lives a while in my sight. What it fears in me leaves me, and the fear of me leaves it. It sings, and I hear its song. Then what I am afraid of comes. I live for a while in its sight. What I fear in it leaves it, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its song. After days of labour, mute in my consternations, I hear my song at last, and I sing it. As we sing, the day turns, the trees move.